So Hasan hasn't had the best record on Ukraine. Batting average on this has been pretty poor, and I'm not saying he supports the Russians. That's, please get it across that he doesn't, as far as I'm aware, unless when it comes to the occupation of Crimea. Then he does support them in that one instance, unless he changed his position from the last time I've heard him talk about the issue. But broadly speaking, he doesn't support the Russian invasion, the one that happened in 2022 at least. Now, he was wrong about whether the invasion was going to happen, and he was pretty boldly wrong. It was a pretty embarrassing moment for him to release these videos where saying, wow, another day, the Russians haven't invaded, it was all war propaganda, and he was changing his YouTube titles to day 17 of the Russia's not invading, and he would update it every day. Day 18 of them not invading, day 19 of them not invading. And he eventually had to eat some humble pie when the Russians, did invade, and he couldn't just disregard all those US intelligence reports. Putting that aside, that wasn't the only big fat L that he's taken on Ukraine. There's also the issue of Crimea, which I think other people like Lonerbox has beaten a little bit more to death than I can. You should go check out his content on that. It's on his main channel. But the other thing that he was really, really wrong on, and I didn't see many people noting it, I feel like I was one of the few that did at least on Twitch, was this position he had on the Kerch Bridge. So for those of you who don't know, the Kerch Bridge is a bridge in occupied Ukraine that was built to connect occupied Crimea to Russia proper. Let's see if I can show you guys where it is. The Kerch Bridge is right down here. It was built up in 2014, 2015 after the Russians invaded. They built it up so they could further extend their hold over their new colonial possession. And after the war started in 2022, that's after, of course, the Crimean invasion and the invasion of Donetsk and the invasion of Luhansk. But after the 2022 invasion started, they started using it to transport loads and loads and loads of military equipment into occupied Crimea and then occupied Kherson and occupied Zaporozhye. Right? And for a very short period of time, parts have occupied the Mykolaiv Oblast, but, that was a while ago. They would transport armored vehicles, artillery guns, bullets, soldiers, fuel trucks, just for fuel, medical equipment for their soldiers, just missiles, air defense, like everything you can think of, mortars, grenades, like everything. If there is something that can be shipped on ground, it was shipped through here. It is one of the main arteries of the Russian war effort. If there is a single supply line in this war that is most important for the current Ukrainian counteroffensive on the Russian side, what is the most important supply line for the Russians to keep moving and keep thriving in order for them to keep their defended positions in Zaporozhye, it is this. This is currently the most important supply line for the Russians as of right now. Of course, that is subject to change as the battlefield changes, but as of right now, it is the most important artery for the Russians, and in multiple points in the war, it has been the most important artery for the Russians. And it will continue to be an extremely important artery and supply line for the Russians as long as the war is continuing to go on. And so the Ukrainians, knowing this, knowing that they could severely undercut the Russian war effort, as if they take out this Kerch Bridge, the Russians are going to have to transport goods from Russia proper all the way down here into Kherson, all the way down into Crimea, all the way into Zaporozhye here. And that's a much more roundabout way, and losing one of your major supply lines going to be very damaging to the defenders here. And so the Ukrainians have been trying to take it out. And recently they attacked the Kerch Bridge, but this isn't the first time they attacked the Kerch Bridge. They actually attacked the Kerch Bridge, I think it was like 6 or 7 months ago. We believe it was with a truck, but we don't know for sure. Either way, the Ukrainians have been trying to target the Kerch Bridge over and over and over because they understand its military significance. And recently they did it again, this time with UAV boat drones. Well, no, it's not a UAV because it's unmanned aerial vehicle, but it was boat drones that they put under the bridge and then they blew them up. And they were able to disable parts of the bridge temporarily. Now, when it was first targeted, Hasan came out with a take that this was bad, this was a war crime, and it is not a legitimate military target. Now, I said at the time that this was very, very wrong, that no military historian would agree with him, no human rights lawyer would agree with him, no international law scholar would agree with him, nobody that actually knows what they're talking about and isn't just shooting the shit with no knowledge would say. Nobody would agree with him on this, right? And I thought, you know, he hadn't mentioned it in a while. Maybe he, from the grapevine of, you know, possibly knowing human rights lawyers or knowing people with experience in the military or, you know, studying any conflict ever in human history, he maybe found this out. Like, oh, actually, it is legitimate to target the supply lines in this way. It is a legitimate military target, and every military on the planet would consider it a legitimate military target. But he hasn't changed his position. In fact, after this recent attack on the Kerch Bridge, he doubled down. Let's see if we can play that clip quick. This is from Post Left Watch on Twitter. They clip chimped him here. They didn't clip chimp, but you get it. They clipped him here.
Well, it's a bridge where, like, the Russian forces are being supplied, but it's also a bridge that, you know, connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So you absolutely can consider it a war crime in the same way that when Russia blows up shit on the civilian infrastructure and claims that they're doing it for, you know, military purposes. It's just like bullshit. Not that it fucking matters. They literally blew up the pipelines, dude. They blew up the pipelines that were bringing in gas into fucking Europe. And it went nowhere. I felt like I was eating every crazy pill on the goddamn planet when I was talking about it. And everyone was like, Hasan, you don't have enough information for this. It's like, what are you talking about? You have to look to, like, who stands to benefit in situations like this, right? So, ultimately... ultimately, it's ridiculous. And this is what happens every single time.
So, oh boy. First off, on the second part about the pipeline, if I was Hasan, I would probably reserve myself for making more bold predictions about what is true and is not true without all the facts. And as of right now, we don't have all the facts on the pipeline explosion and what caused the pipeline to explode, Nord Stream. It could have been Ukrainians. I think they definitely have motivations to do it, but I wouldn't say that we know that it was them, because we don't know it was them. We have no substantial, like, concrete evidence that can make us say we know it was the Ukrainians. We don't have that. Is it likely that it could have been them? Absolutely, but we don't know for sure. And if I was Hasan, I would be staying away a decent distance of any, you know, bold predictions of this type, given his record on this war. Now, putting that aside, because that's a topic for another day anyway, let's focus on the first part of this. That now that you've heard his point, we'll go through it again. We'll go through it again now that you've listened to him uninterrupted, because I don't want to, you know, interrupt him every 5 seconds and say, wait, without you hearing his full line. So now we're going to go through it again, and we're going to stop when I hear something that's wrong.
Well, it's a bridge where, like, the Russian forces are being supplied, but it's also a bridge that, you know, connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So you absolutely can consider it a war crime in the same way that when Russia blows up shit on the civilian infrastructure and claims that they're doing it for, you know, military purposes. It's just like bullshit.
Okay, so it is not a war crime to blow up the bridge because there's a definite military objective of blowing up the bridge. And it's not to terrorize civilians or to just slaughter civilians. It's to undermine the Russian supply line that goes through the Kerch Bridge. And as long as it is in pursuance of a definite military objective on a basic level, it isn't a war crime. And in fact, it can also even, and this is most international, I think, no, not most, all international law scholars would agree that it doesn't just have to support military objectives and only military it doesn't have to only support the military and only be used by the military for it to still be a legitimate target and not a war crime to take it out. For example, even though the Russians have targeted the power grid in Ukraine in a way that makes it pretty clear that it's not really in pursuance of a concrete military objective, and it's meant to terrorize the civilian population, undercut their heat during the winter, undercut electricity, undercut hospital electricity that's necessary for them to treat patients. It's pretty clear that that isn't a military objective, as in, oh, we struck this power grid in order for us to take out their air defense, so then we can take out this base right here. No, that isn't the case, because they explicitly were stating, we are disabling the electrical grid to freeze out the Ukrainians. They were open about that. So that is a war crime, right? That isn't a definite military objective. That is terrorizing civilians. But if a power grid is used by both civilians and military, it is not necessarily a war crime to take out that power grid. A power grid can actually still be a legitimate military target, even when still used by civilians, as long as you can clarify the definite military objective, which the Russians couldn't do, and many of their strikes on civilian infrastructure and the power grid. And as long as the civilian casualties aren't excessive, and you're making an effort to try to control for that, and you're not just willy-nilly, just no regard for civilian casualties whatsoever, just bombing everything in pursuance of this military objective, it isn't a war crime. Now, there's a question about like what amount of civilian casualties is acceptable and is not acceptable, and quite frankly, I don't feel like I'm in a position to make that judgment. I'm not an expert on how that type of calculus is made, and it is honestly a pretty sick business to try to figure out what amount of civilian casualties is acceptable and isn't acceptable in pursuance of a military objective. But that determinations have had to be made throughout every single war in the history of humanity. Every single war. If what Hasan was saying here is true, that you cannot target any bridge that has ever been used or is being used by civilians in any way, then we couldn't disable any bridge anywhere during any war, whether it was during World War I or World War II. Then you could have a scenario where there is a bridge that connects one town to another town, and the German SS are about to march over that bridge to occupy that town and commit who knows how many untold atrocities. But because an old babushka woman named Gertrude uses that bridge between 5 and 8 p.m. to go pick up turnips on the other side of the town, it is now no longer a legitimate military target, and you have to let the SS travel over the bridge into the town, slaughter everybody, occupy it, giving your troops problems. Obviously, that isn't workable. You can't conduct warfare if you can't target an enemy's supply lines, if you can't target bridges that are used to transport troops, used to transport supplies, used to, occupy towns. You can't conduct warfare without the ability to strike these targets. And also, there's some more nuance to add here too, because a once civilian target, as in a civilian, something you shouldn't hit, that the civilian you shouldn't attack it, can become a military target through the use of the military. Example, hospitals. While in the vast majority of circumstances, you should not bomb hospitals, right? You should not target hospitals. If we're talking about a situation like Mariupol or a situation like Bakhmut, where the entirety of the city is engaged in like street by street, room by room combat, and a hospital gets occupied by soldiers and is now being used by soldiers to lob mortars and rockets and artillery at enemy positions, or at the positions of whatever their enemy is, it has now become a legitimate military target, even if it was civilian infrastructure and has been used by civilians. None of this nuance comes into calculation for Hasan. Under these rules of war, the Ukrainians would never be able to target the Russian supply lines ever, because all Russian supply lines in this war are to some extent used by civilians, whether it be the railways, whether it be the roads, whether it be everything. Meaning that we just can't target their supplies. It's just impossible to target their supplies. How could we have won World War II or any war that we've ever fought if we didn't have the ability to target an enemy's supply lines? As long as it is in pursuance of a concrete military objective, and you are calculating for civilian casualties to make sure that they aren't excessive, and you can point to that concrete military objective. In this case, it would be that this is the main artery for the Russians and occupied Crimea, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. It transports tanks, it transports artillery guns, it transports bullets, it transports troops. Therefore, if we take out that bridge, they won't be able to transport these goods. They won't be able to bring artillery shells into Kherson and then shell Kherson city proper, killing civilians. They won't be able to bring in bullets that then shoot at Ukrainian soldiers. There's the definite military objective. Then you calculate for civilian casualties, saying what would be the best time to strike to, try to make sure that the least amount of civilians die, and make sure, or possibly no civilians die. That's the calculus that needs to go into it. And if he wants to criticize the fact that 2 civilians did die on the bridge, he can criticize that if he wants to say it should have been done at a different time or they should have been more careful. That, I think, could be a legitimate criticism, because then you're having the calculus about quote unquote collateral damage. I hate that word, but that the calculations about quote unquote collateral damage, right? You're making those calculations, but he completely disregards that. That's not the question. He believes that the targeting of the bridge in and of itself, because civilians use it or have used it, that makes it a war crime. Well, then the Ukrainians can't conduct warfare. It's just impossible. It's just impossible. Now, I understand that me being Dylan Burns, what would he, I think he called me a ruthless neoliberal. Maybe he's not going to believe me, okay? I don't know how many international law scholars I would need to contact or get in contact with to explain this concept to Hasan for the millionth time after he keeps repeating this again and again, and he's not learning the lesson. But the least I can do is bring up this Reuters article, which talks about, when is it a war crime and when is it not a war crime? Here we go. When are attacks against civilian infrastructure war crimes? This is from Reuters. I don't know, maybe it's too liberal. Who knows? What does international law say? The Geneva Convention and additional protocols shaped by the international courts say that parties involved in a military conflict must distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives, and that attacks on civilian objects are forbidden. This prohibition is codified in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which earlier this year opened an investigation into possible war crimes in Ukraine. That seems clear-cut. But some infrastructure owned and used by civilians can be a military objective. Military objectives are defined as those objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action, and whose destruction or capture offers a definite military advantage, which the Kerch Bridge clearly has. Is energy infrastructure military or civilian? This is what I was talking about earlier. Energy infrastructure. This is something you would think, oh, okay, this is always civilian because it's used by civilians. Not necessarily. Power infrastructure has long been considered a valid military objective as long as it supports an enemy's army's activities, even if the system also supports the civilian population, writes military law expert Michael Schmidt in the Article of War blog run by the Lieber into blah, 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 Military Academy West Point. As Russia's strikes on the power infrastructure have intensified, it seems increasingly unlikely that its armed forces can name a definite military objective for each attack. Simply put, Russian forces are almost certainly striking many targets that do not qualify as military objectives. How are military needs balanced against civilian? Even if some of the targets could be considered military objectives, that is not the end of the story, says Catherine Fortin, Associate Professor of International Law at Utrecht University. The military must consider whether the damage and loss incurred by civilians, and this is the area where Hasan could actually have wiggle room to criticize the strike, but that's not how he did it. The military must consider whether the damage and loss incurred by civilians in such attacks are excessive compared to the concrete and direct military advantages. In this instance, the incidental loss of life and injury to civilians can be expected seems very large given the power outages are making it impossible for surgeons to carry on their work, affecting people's access to health care, and creating conditions in which vulnerable people are dying due to cold or hunger. How do war crime prosecutors consider the current attacks? Nigel Provost, lead prosecutor for a team of international experts assisting Kiev's war crime investigators, told Reuters that Russian attacks in the past 2 months have focused on eliminating infrastructure crucial to the means of civilian survival, such as heat, water, power, and medical facilities. Both Schmidt and Pavos say the scale and intensity of the attacks can additionally amount to them being considered as acts of threats of violence, the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population. This is forbidden under international humanitarian law. Now, for those of you who also might be under some delusion of the Kerch Bridge, without it, all the civilians in Crimea are going to die or they can't get food, that's not the case. The Russians still have the ability to transport goods by plane. The Russians still have the ability to ferry people across and to ferry goods across. The Russians also have alternative routes to get supplies in. For example, through their newly conquered land bridge, which is how a lot of people are actually leaving Crimea right now, because they some of them see the writing on the wall. Other really dumb people are still going to Crimea, not now through the Kerch Bridge, but through occupied territory, knowing that, hey, you know, one day the opportunity to leave this is going to be a lot more difficult, and they're still going through occupied territory to go vacation in occupied Crimea. So I would not say that the Kerch Bridge is essentially vital for the life of the people in Crimea. It is not the only route for people to leave Crimea. It is not the only way that supplies and goods and services get into Crimea or out of Crimea. It is not causing anybody to die of like injuries or death when it comes to like, oh, there's no hospitals running. It doesn't like undercut their ability to get food. They can still leave through other alternative routes. It is not a war crime. There is no international law scholar that would call it a war crime. What this honestly feels like is Hasan wants to both sides it. Everybody sees the targeting of apartment blocks by the Russians. Everybody sees the targeting of electrical infrastructure in places like Kharkiv. I filmed that myself. And they could say, wow, this seems pretty excessive. This doesn't seem for a military objective. This seems like they want to freeze out the population. It's meant to terrorize the population. This is a war crime. And we need to both sides it for whatever reason. And so instead of like finding somewhere like, hey, actually, the Ukrainians committed a war crime here because they used this type of munition in a densely populated area. No, he doesn't find an example of that. Instead, he finds this and he's just like, I don't know, these kind of feel the same with zero nuance. I know they both vibe like war crimes. So, you know, it's a war crime. He didn't put any thought into this. He put zero thought into this. It's just, this has been or is being used by civilians in some capacity, therefore, it's a war crime. I don't know if he has his own special definition of war crime that's different than the Geneva Convention, that is different than the International Criminal Court, that's different than what every single human rights lawyer and every single international law scholar like knows what a war crime and how you define a war crime. Like, I know there's different scholars who have disagreements on this stuff and like where are the bounds of acceptable collateral damage and not acceptable collateral damage. There's disagreement, but none of that disagreement lies within what Hasan is talking about right here. This is just Hasan being uninformed, talking about Ukraine for like the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, who knows how many times now. I understand that he has a concern for civilians, but if he wants to say 2 people died in this strike, 2 people died from these drones, and I don't think that was appropriate collateral damage, I think they should have done more to protect them, that would be a legitimate critique that some, even if probably not the majority, but some international law scholars would say, yes, okay, there's an argument to be had here. But there isn't an argument to be had in the fact that the Kerch Bridge isn't a legitimate military target. You can clearly define the military objective that is achieved by destroying the bridge. Clearly. The bridge, by the way, which was built in occupied territory to help support the Russian occupation. Because if people really think that the Kerch Bridge is necessary for human life, the Kerch Bridge is new. The Kerch Bridge is new. Before the Kerch Bridge was built, people in Crimea lived. They didn't all die from like starvation or lack of medical treatment. So there was a world where the Kerch Bridge didn't exist and the people of Crimea still prospered and lived. Man, this whole thing is just so silly, man. This is just so silly. I just think he wants to both sides it. That's what it is, man. That's what it feels like to me, at least. Of course, I can't read the intentions of Hasan. I'm sure there is a level of pureness in the intention of like wanting to protect civilians, but his ignorance is getting in the way of him being able to, I think, analyze the situation, you know, professionally or rationally. Dylan, you give him too much credit and leeway when I think he deserves. How do we know he didn't put thought into this? Because it doesn't sound like he puts much thought into this. Listen to what he's saying here. Okay, let's just listen to what he said one more time. Tell me how much thought went into this, really.
Well, it's a bridge where like the Russian forces are being supplied, but it's also a bridge that, you know, connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. So you absolutely can consider it a war crime in the same way that when Russia blows up shit on the civilian infrastructure.
Dude, this would mean like, what? Can we not? This would, God, man, it's like, no, the reason I don't think he put any thought into this is because if he would have Googled this, just literally Googled this, one of the first result, whatever result comes up, it's going to say, yeah, no, that isn't necessarily a war crime. Like, you can't just say it's a war crime. This is a legitimate military target. If he Googled anything, he would have come to that conclusion. Asked anyone with expertise on the issue. But also, here's a question. If this is true, that war crimes is whenever you blow up thing that has been used by civilian or is being used by civilians, then would this mean that as the Ukrainian army retreated from an area, let's say from the Kiev Oblast, when they were retreating into the city itself as the Russians advanced, if they were to like blow up a bridge to slow down the Russians, it doesn't even have civilians on it, but it was used by civilians, to, get to a store in the local community before the war, is that now a war crime? Because the Ukrainians blew up a bridge that the Wagner group wanted to cross and occupy villages and engage in their cleansing campaign, which is what they referred to it, by the way, not how I referred to it. That's from Russian communications, when they took people and extrajudicially executed them on the side of the road. None of this makes sense once you've put like a modicum of thought into it. Anyway, I got nothing else to say about this. I don't really think Hasan's gonna learn his lesson on this. I think he's probably just gonna keep repeating this over and over again. I hope I am pleasantly surprised. I don't want to read too much into his intentions because I really don't like reading into the intentions of other people, so I won't. But I will just say that the more he repeats this, when I know that someone must be emailing him, somebody with some knowledge must be DMing him or adding him somewhere, and he must have seen some critique somewhere, the longer this goes on, the less benefit of the doubt that I'm going to grant the guy. My community wants to grant him no benefit of the doubt. But, I believe in humanity, peace and love, yada, yada, all that hippie shit. So whatever,